Thank you very much for coming. This is the last presentation for today, and hopefully you are not so tired. So you will listen to me, and I believe that this presentation will bring to you some new and useful information. The most important, the information shouldn't be new only, but useful too. So in the morning, there was a presentation about Git, about basics of Git, and this is something for people. This presentation is for people who are rather beginners in Git, and for people who would like to work with Git and Developer Studio from Openedge. So in this presentation, we will see some basic guidelines how Git can be used with Developer Studio. This is something about me. So you can see that I used to be a Progress Software employee up to 2008. Then the Czech subsidiary of Progress was terminated, and I was fired. And it was good to me. Finally, it showed to be good. Now I work as a freelancer, and I am an independent Progress Software developer and consultant. But because I'm slightly approaching my retirement age, so I don't have so many customers as before today. So, what about Git? What is it, Git? What is it, Git? We have several explanations for this word. What's very interesting for us, it's not so interesting. This could be interesting. Distributed version control system, which was originally designed by Linus Torvalds, and he calls it mostly global information tracker. I especially like the last one most, because it very frequently happens if you do not know how to use Git. Then you will get to real problems. So I will mention some guidelines about using Git during this presentation, but it's not Developer Studio problem. It's a problem of Git itself. Yeah. There are some topics which, one more point. Some people, especially in US, call it JIT. I've never heard it in Europe, but some people in US, as it said, I've read it in the dictionary, use it. Using Git gives you a lot of options how you can use it in your development and even deployment. And not everything can be in scope of this presentation. Especially, we will not talk about the background, what's behind it. So we will not talk about server pipelines, source code beautifier, how you can make your source code better, look better. About source code analysis, about some pipelines, how you can automatically compile your source code into the R codes. When something changes in the source code, and about deployment automation. Who is interested in this topic could eventually ask Gilles Carret, who is also on PUG this year, and he has a lot of experience with this background processing, on Git. Well, so. Let's summarize the main features of Git on this version, on this slide. What's especially interesting here is a feature which is called branching, or which creates and versus branches. It's very interesting from one point of view, and it is that some people call it Git killer. If you do not use branches in a well-organized and a well-maintained way, so you will get into real problems. So if you decide to use Git, you should define some very, very strong naming, especially naming conventions, how the branches you are creating should be named and how they should be used. Otherwise, real problems. There are also some features which are not supported in Developer Studio. It's a very nice feature which is called work tree, which is implemented in Git itself, but you cannot use it in Developer Studio, and I can show you the example how it is used, how you can see it in Developer Studio during the presentation. This is some overview of the structure of Git. So you can see that if you work with Git, that you have something which is your origin is called origin, your remote repository, and it should work, yes, and you also work with your local repository. You should know that every Git user clones his own version of the origin of the remote repository, and it is a full version of the repository. So in the development environment, you have multiple copies of the repository. Every user, every developer has his own copy of the repository. And then you have something what's called head. That's the branch you are actually working on. It's the active branch. And we can also say that it is the contents of the working directory. That's the set of the source codes you are actually working on. And then you have a couple or many Git commands, which let you move data between these structures. So something's missing here. Do you know what's missing here? It's not normally displayed when you display structure of Git, but it's stash or stashing area, which is very important if you work on multiple requests, for example, on some development, on some change requests. You can, at the same time, you can solve some incidents and so on. So you will probably work with stashes, which is a temporary area where you store your work, which is under development, but has not been finished yet. So you can see that your first task is to get the copy of your remote repository to head. Then you work on your head, you commit your changes to your local repository, and eventually push the changes to the origin, to the remote repository again. What's missing here is merging, and we will mention it a little bit later when we see some different structures of the system. You can see it's not here, so we don't see on the slide, we do not see how you can compare two different versions of the source code. What's important here with Git is that with Git you can one commit at a time. One commit at a time. You cannot have two commits with two different versions of your source code. Just one commit at a time, and this commit commits all your repository. It does not commit only the change. In fact, it seems to you that you commit only the changes you have made, but the result of the commit is the complete new version of the repository in a particular branch. Well, this is something, some basics of Git, and now we will switch to GitHub or some other remote repository solution. GitHub is a very friendly and a very useful hosted storage area for Git repositories. Everyone can use it. You can create your own accounts on GitHub. You can create your new repositories on GitHub. And work with GitHub. It is some nice web-based user interface. So it's good. And it has a lot of features behind it. And you can also add plugins like automatic deployment, compilations, and so on behind GitHub using third-party tools. So it's a good choice. It's a good choice for GitHub storage. But there are other ones also. We could mention some like GitLab, Bitbucket, Launchpad, Perforce, SourceForge. These are mostly products which you can use for free, but you can also buy some enterprise version or premium version for some with a larger set of features you can use. The same is valid for GitHub. There are also some server-based Git environments like Azure or Amazon, which are paid only, and these products are mostly used by large enterprises. But all these platforms are good for small to middle enterprises. If you want to, so that is the first. That was the first product you have to use if you want to use GitHub with your development. If you want to use Git in your with your developer studio, then you need a special plugin which is called eGit, and it's available with any version of Eclipse. So if you install Developer Studio with Progress, then it's very likely you will have eGit available in your environment. But it's very easy to find where it is. The eGit version varies dependent on the version of Eclipse, which also depends on the version of Progress. So this is a short table here where you can find which version of eGit you have to use, with which version of Progress. I'm sorry, I have some problem with speaking now. It may eventually happen that I will stop talking during the presentation, so it will be the end of the presentation, but hopefully it won't happen during the time we have. So you can easily find, if you have eGit installed with your Developer Studio, in the help menu of Eclipse or Developer Studio, where you can find this small icon, and if you click on that icon, that you can see what version of eGit you have with your Developer Studio. Everything what I have talked about can be seen in real life. So if I start Openedge, under help, about, here is the icon. If I click on it, I can see exactly the versions which I need with this version of Developer Studio. It does not necessarily mean that you need to use Developer Studio when using eGit. You can use any text editor. You may use App Builder, you may use Procedure Editor, or text editor of any kind to develop Openedge application using Git. Because the head is just a contents of source files in a directory, so you can use any editor to edit files in the directory. That's very simple. Yeah. But whatever happens, you will not be happy with just eGit. You always need some additional software to use eGit on your client side. What's very frequently used is Git GUI. Git GUI is a very friendly GUI application which helps you to work with Git on your client side, and it also contains something like Git Bash command line version of Git. So if you look at the documentation of Git, there is a list of all commands. You can learn how to use them with this Git GUI version, and you will need it if you will use Git in your development environment. You will definitely need this command line version, this Git Bash, this command line version of Git. There are some simple tools also. GitHub Desktop. It has a limited features, so for people who do some basic tasks only, it's very simple to use. They can use it, and you can also use GitHub command line interface, which is command line interface to GitHub. You can use this tool to run Git commands on GitHub repository, on the remote repository. Git GUI is not the only one tool you can use, not the only one GUI tool you can use on your client side. There are some others. Some people prefer source tree, some people prefer fork, for example. So again, we can start Git GUI here. You can see that I have a lot of repositories here. Usually I use this one. So I can open that one repository, and I have a nice GUI where I can work with local Git repository, and I can fetch or pull data from the remote repository, and I can also push data or commit data to the remote repository. And with that, you can see also the Git Bash tool, which is the command line version of Git. I don't see if I have some commands here. No, we can use one. Section. Kdyby to bylo tak. Nevím, I have made some error. It's written here. Maybe this one. Oh, that's correct. So this is the command, how you can use, how you can display your local configuration of your Git client. It's pretty interesting because in your Git environment you have a couple of configuration options which you could use. You can define your favorite text editor as the default GUI editor in GUI. So if you run git GUI and you choose view file, your favorite editor is used for that. You can instruct GUI when it compares the contents of two files, whether it should ignore case or not. You can also say on global, on a global way for complete repository, you can also say which files are excluded from tracking and which files are not committed to the remote repository. It's very we will mention it later, but you probably do not want to store R codes in your repository. So it's a good way, it's a good idea to put asterisk point R using wildcards text in your git ignore file, global git ignore file, to ignore all of them. In fact, Developer Studio does it instead of you implicitly, at least on my computer. But it may happen that somebody has some different configuration and that it stores the binary files in the repository. Yeah. You can also change your merge tool. You can change behavior of end of lines, which is very useful options. If you have mixed development, where some developers develop on Windows, which places carriage return line feed at the end of the line, and some people develop on Linux, which puts only line feed or new line at the end of the line, that if you set, then it's good idea to set on Windows the auto CRLF feature to true, because when storing the file in index or CRLF characters, carriage return line feed characters are converted to new line only. Yeah, so it complies with the Linux definitions. If you have Windows development only, it's better to set this parameter to false, so that no conversion takes place, because you don't develop on Linux. And if you are working on Linux environment, it's a good idea to set this value to input. It means that if in the Linux environment, you read a file which accidentally has carriage return line feed at the end of the line, it converts it to a new line, but not the vice versa. If you write the file back, it does not convert new line to carriage return line feed. And you can also, the last option is good for comparing files. You can say what is a space, what is a white space. There are 6 tokens, 3 are enabled by default, and 3 are disabled by default. And you can change this behavior by setting this parameter. So, for example, blank at end of line is a white space. If you write some line and then space, 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 so the spaces at the end of lines are not compared or are excluded from comparison with the other versions of the file. Is it clear? The same is valid for end of file. blank end of file, and the same is valid for space before tab. If you accidentally press space, space, and tab, then this is also ignored. So these are some useful settings. If you eventually do not have eGit installed in your Eclipse, you can simply install it as a plugin. So this is the way how to do that. You can go to Help, Install new software. Under Install new software, you will write this URL. That's the URL to eGit on Eclipse. Then you will choose these options. It's enough, these two options, and you will install this software. Unfortunately, I cannot do a demo on that because I am connected to the internet, it's no problem. But it doesn't work very well when you already have eGit installed in your developer studio. So I do not recommend testing it when you already have, if you already have eGit. Well, so it's about the configuration, about the software you need for these purposes, and now we will switch to Developer Studio directly. So probably the first step you want to do is you want to migrate your existing code base to Git. There are two options how to do that. You can take your source code you have, your application you have today, create a new repository, not using Developer Studio, and then clone this repository and define a project on this repository, define an Openedge project on this repository, which is a recommended solution. Or you can create a new repository on your existing Openedge project, which I do not recommend very much, because you may encounter some unpredictable problems. The first option is very clear, but I don't say it is easy, because if you want to migrate your existing code base to a Git repository, it's a project. It's not a single step. It's a project. It's a process which can take months. And it is the same as if you buy a new hardware to your application. If you buy a new hardware to your application, it's good to optimize the existing environment, optimize everything to start from scratch or almost from scratch. So if you migrate your existing code base to the repository, to a Git repository, so it's a good way to think about what's the structure of my source code? Should I beautify the source code in some way? Fix some problems and so on and so on. And only the other step, the last one step, an easy step, the last step is easy, is that you will create a new repository on GitHub or any other hosted environment, and then commit or add all the files you have to the repository. So I can show you the other one. I have a couple of repositories on GitHub. I like especially this new one, new rep. So you can see that I have some repository on GitHub. It has some URL, which is used when you clone the repository. And it has some structure, some source codes. You can read. You can develop here. That's not a problem. You can write. There are some source codes. You can write the source code here. If it's simple for you, you are familiar with it. You don't need it to put it in Developer Studio, but it has to cooperate in some way. So what I can do here, I can create where is GitHub here? Not this one. It's very simple. I can create a new repository, which I have to do that way that I have to close it and start again. Or I am learned to do it this way. Maybe there's a better way. I don't know. I use clone existing repository. Source repository will be the URL where my remote repository resides. And the local I have to copy because it's a little bit complex path. Where is progress? Can you see? Here we can see that I have a couple of projects. Some of them are associated with some Git repositories. Some of them are not associated with Git repository. So I will take this path. I will copy it here, and I will put a name of my new repository of my new local repository. I have new rep 2, so I can use new rep 6, and that's all. What's important here? The new rep 6 directory must not exist, otherwise you will get an error. Okay, I am ready. I have a new repository. We can see it here. New rep 6. And then I can go to Developer Studio. Oh, there's one more. Interesting. If you create a new repository, there are some automatically some readme. It's cloned from. You can see what I have on the origin from the remote repository because I have downloaded origin and it's my head at this moment. Yeah. So I can create a new Openedge project. How is it done? New rep 6. Yeah, it's only new rep 6. Next, finish. Oh, I have forgotten the databases. I can add later, there's no problem. And you can see that it's automatically associated with the repository created. We are on branch main or master, which is translated to main here, and we have the source codes here. I can add some properties here because I have forgotten it. It's the Openedge database connection sports 2020 because it is the only database Openedge works on, as we know. And what you can see is that we immediately have some changes here. These are some of them are Git related, and some of them are not Git related. So they are Developer Studio or Openedge related. Yeah. it's very likely that we do not want these files to be committed to the remote repository. So what shall we do with it? We will ignore it. It's very simple. Yes, exactly. We will ignore it. And if we ignore it, I will mark them all. Then you can see there is new file, which I have to ignore again because well, no tak. Because a git ignore, that git ignore file was created in my directory, I can look at it and I can see what should not be tracked, what should not be put on index, what should not be sent to the remote repository. I have no global ignore file here because it's a new Git repository, new local Git repository, and I haven't used the git config, the git config command. Yes. I can add here, it's very simple. I can add here if I find the I cannot find asterisk here. So I can on my keyboard, so I cannot find it, but I can put here whatever I want now, my file dot p, and my file dot p will not be stored in the repository. So what do I have here now? I have a copy of the remote repository in my local repository, including all history of the repository. So I can go from master, from the remote branch or from any other branch, I can go back to its parents and to the origin, or even to the origin of the repository. And I can start working with it. I'm sorry. This was wrong. It's very likely that I am not the only developer in the organization. So what you have to do, you have to allow access to the remote repository to other people, to other members of your development team also. This is done on the GitHub level. In GitHub, we have a repository, and under setting, collaborators, it's an engineer, so it requires some more verification. You can add people. This is my Gmail account. The original one is not a Gmail account, it's my personal account, and this is my Gmail account. So this is the other collaborator who can connect to this repository. And if I add a collaborator, I can define his access rights, his permissions, what he can do. Yeah. So it's what's important here, the collaborator must have a GitHub account. So each member of your team should, if you develop on GitHub, so then each member of your team should have his own GitHub account, and then you can associate or you can grant access of this collaborator or of your members of your team to the repository. There is other way how to do that. Can you suggest? What we can eventually do, it's a little bit more complicated, but what we can eventually do is that every user, every member of your team has his own signature. Every member of your team creates his own signature, and you will enable signed commits on your repository. So in that way, all members of your team can access this repository with the same username, with the same access privileges, but every commit will be signed with his signature. And then you will be able to recognize, based on the signature, you will be able to recognize who has done a particular commit.
Why should you do that?
So?
Why should you do that? Is it costly to have a GitHub account?
It depends. It depends. There are some. I don't see any specific advantage of any of these options. Some people like that, and some people like that. We are almost running out of time, so we have to speed up a little bit. If you create a user on GitHub, then this particular user has some type of access to the to GitHub and some type of access to the repository. Both is important because you have to define something like team security. I call it, that's my expression, it's nothing formal. Team security, which is also repository security, and team member security. Team member security, it's something about how a particular person, how the user accesses the GitHub. For example, how he logins to GitHub. Whether you use, for example, two-phase authorization or not. So it is about to make sure that if a user logs into GitHub, we can be sure that it is that user, that it is not a hacker or someone like that. And the repository security is defined on a repository level, and it defines security rules for the complete repository. So this is clear. Team repository is clear. Everyone is aware of that the repository should be secure. There should be some permission, access rights, restrictions, and so on, some approvers, and so on. But do not forget this one, that you must be sure that if user XYZ logs onto GitHub, that it's really user XYZ and no one else. That's something what's sometimes forgotten. Normal work with GitHub, with Git, is that you work with branches. So that's something what's something like a kind of standard. If you want to work with branches, then on the project level, on the project level. So here on this project level, on the right mouse, there is a team option, and this is all you need, almost all you need to work with Git. So here you can switch repository, switch to branches. I have no branch defined here, but I can download some from the server. And now you can see that I have switched to branch dev 002, which has some versions of source codes. It's very likely the same because I do some changes here and there. It's very likely the same like master. What does this branch change do? It checkouts the contents of a particular branch from local or from the remote repository. It depends on what you choose, and puts the contents of this branch to your working directory. So it puts all files you have in your repository with the version in this branch to your directory. Here we have just 4 files, 4 source codes, but you may have 5,000 of them, for example. It's a lot of data, and sometimes it may cause some delays when you switch between branches. There is some undocumented feature I will mention if we have time. Undocumented and still in development feature, which I will mention if we have time. I don't think so, but that you can check out only a portion of your repository. But normally Git works that way, that you replace all your repository here, but keeps your local changes. Yeah, you keep your local changes, so you don't rewrite the changes you have made on some other branch. That's exactly what I say, that I said it before, that the branches are Git killer. Because all changes, and it's general for Git, it's not only on Developer Studio. Git changes are always made in your working directory, and if you change the branch, then the changes made in your working directory remain. But in other words, it means if you make changes to some files, they are not associated with a particular branch. If you change the branch, the changes remain on your file system, on your working directory, and you can commit these changes with another directory. So that is why you have to use stashes. It's also included in the menu. If you need, if you need to change your, branch, and you have made some changes, then you can put these changes to a stash area, to a named stash area. You give a name to it, and you should also have very good naming convention for these stashes. Put them in stash area and return to the versions which were there before these changes, and then you can change the branch. You can do other stuff, commit the changes, and then you can restore your changes from the stashing area, put it to your working directory, and continue with your changes. That's normal. Well, we are almost out of time, so I will mention only some fast stuff. For view changes, you have a text compare view in your for viewing changes. You have a text compare tool in your in Developer Studio. It is here. Hopefully. Team. There is no history. Here you can see flow of the file, but not the changes. Team. No, I have no history here. Yeah, so I only was. So there is a view which compares two versions of your files. I'm sorry, I am not able to find it in here at this moment. I will switch to the presentation. Excuse me? Yeah, but we will talk about merge a little bit later. And we have to done it. This, if you make your changes, that at the end you should commit your changes. And you commit your changes to the local repository. That's the first step. You can also decide, every commit must be associated with some commit message. You are not allowed to commit any changes without a commit message. So it must be used, and it should contain something reasonable, something what makes sense, and not blah, 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 or something like that. Yeah. And you can also commit and push the changes to the remote repository. If you push your changes to a remote repository and the branch you are committing does not exist in the remote repository, then it is created in the remote repository. And what you said about merging, that was, yeah, it's another topic. The last one. So, before you commit, you decide what should be committed. It is moving from unstaged changes to staged changes, from here to here, and then you can do commit or commit and push. Then, based on the decision, the changes are in local repository or in a remote repository. And then you should merge the changes with the origin or with some other branch. And you can do local merge, or you can do remote merge. So you can, if you commit your changes to the local repository only, then you can merge these changes with some local branch. If you do commit and push, that you can merge your changes on GitHub, directly on GitHub. Local merge is not recommended. It's not recommended because it's against some security rules. There should be always some approval who approves the changes, which is other person which does not reside on your computer. So on GitHub level, you can even uncheck local possibility for local changes, and then local merges, and then local merges are not allowed because every commit, every merge requires an approver. That's very important. And one last thing, we will switch the deployment because we don't have time. One last thing, there is a feature which is under development and is not well documented, and it's sparse checkout. Sparse checkout is set on the repository. It allows you to define a subset of files which are fetched to your working directory. Please, if you are interested in it, you should use it with care, and you should check what's new, because it's under development, its behavior may change in the future. But if you have a repository which has 10,000 source codes, so cloning all the complete 10,000 source code does not make sense usually. So you can define only a subset of these source codes which are cloned to your local repository, and then work with this subset only. Okay. That's all from my side. If you have any questions, I'm sorry there's a little bit more of it, but we don't have time for that.
You cloned the repository and you used Git GUI. You can use other tools, but is it also possible to clone the repository in eGit? Because, well, eGit we have Openedge Studio, and we want to do everything in Openedge Studio.
You can clone the repository directly in eGit, but it's much easier in Git GUI, as you could have seen.
I use Git extensions, also very.
So that's correct. That's another option. You can clone a repository directly in Developer Studio, but I prefer Git GUI. Any other questions? Okay, if not, thank you very much. Now you